So for those of you on online and for future viewers, this is our second training on utility systems. First time around, and there's a video link for that, we have been talking about why energy is important, and also the importance of kind of really looking at how the utility industry came to be. Why does this matter for movements? And that is really setting us up for a session today. Today we're really looking at what are the forces and factors that are changing the utility industry as it is, and really what is shifting in really quite a big way. And then we'll talk a little bit about how we as movements can create pressure points on that and do big creative things. So like last time, if you have questions or you just want to interject, feel free. I think, can everyone on the computer hear me okay?
Yep. Yes.
Awesome. Yep. So yeah, computer folks and folks in the room, just feel free to jump in and interject. I hope folks have either attended or looked through the video from last time. If there are questions that I think were covered in that, I'll just say, hey, take a look at that. And there will be kind of further building in future sessions. So we're going to go from there. I wanted to start with a really quick overview, and also wanted to thank Patty for helping out with all these logistics. Wanted to do a really quick overview of the structure of the grid, just so we can remember. And Patty, I'm going to need you to start screen sharing momentarily. I know that there's a lot of juggling that's happening.
Just handling it, Grace. Use that for now.
So I've drawn up here, and we'll do a lot of discussion about really what's all changing and playing in this, a diagram of the grid, and I also have a slide that reflects basically the same thing. But there's basically 4 phases to operating an electric grid. You have the extraction of energy, which is coal mines and uranium mines and natural gas fracking, and the wind and solar itself. You have your power plants, which convert that into electricity, whether that's a nuclear plant or a coal plant or a natural gas plant or a wind turbine or a solar farm or whatever it is. You have your transmission system, which is high voltage electric wires that are transmitting energy hundreds or thousands of miles to substations, which are each of these little points located in neighborhoods, where the voltage is stepped down to a voltage that's closer to what's actually used in homes, and then sent out kind of in a local network on a distribution system, which is all of the poles and wires that you see going through your neighborhood. And there's individual little transformer boxes on these poles that route power into individual homes.
Are you going to let me know when I should start screen sharing, or should I already be doing it?
If you could just put up the first screen share, that would be awesome. I'm going to kind of be switching back and forth a little bit. This is just kind of an overview. We talked about this a little bit last time, but this is the system as we have it now from a physical perspective. We're going to be talking a lot about the economics and politics of, well, what happens with the system is here. Is that on, Patty?
Yep, the screen has been shared. Can somebody on the computer let me know if you can see it?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, great. Again, here you have power plants, a transmission system, and a distribution system. The thing I really want to emphasize is that day to day, most of us interact with that distribution system all the time. We are flipping on lights, we are using our computers, we're doing all these things that take charge. And you probably also see the power lines and transformers and all of that going through your neighborhood. In terms of cost, all of that infrastructure is a pretty significant portion of the total cost of the whole thing. It's about 30%. So you have to pay for actually routing the wires to each individual place it's used, and that's a lot of wires. But they're very small in comparison to this big, massive upstream system. So if you can go to the second slide here, and sorry for folks in the room that this is small, I look either of those 2 places. This grid is huge. if you actually think about it in terms of the capital cost of building the system and the physical size of it, this is the largest machine on Earth. You can literally think of the entire North American electric grid as one interconnected electronic machine that is managing supply of power and usage of power all over the place. Again, feel free to stop me or check in if any of this is confusing. This giant national grid, we talked a little bit last time about how the system emerged, but it's essentially drawing power from all of these power plants in this massive network and sending it to all of the places where it's used. And you can see when you look at the transmission lines, and this is a map just of transmission, that the network is densest where there's a lot of power being used, because you have to put a lot of energy into those places, which are mostly large cities. Make sense? Cool. The thing I want to emphasize here is that this is actually a pretty complex operation because you can't store electricity, or you can, but it's extremely difficult and expensive, and we usually don't. So all of the utilities on the continent effectively have to simultaneously match the supply of energy, which is what's being cranked out by all of these different power plants, with the demand of energy, which is all of our residential and commercial and industrial behavior that uses energy in real time. Okay? The two have to match basically exactly.
Are you referring to North American continent?
Yes, but grids in other continents work very slowly.
Just curious, I didn't think there was lines going over the Panama Canal or something like that.
Yeah, each continent or a large region effectively has a separate grid, and in large parts of the global south, the grids are much smaller and much less connected.
That's good.
But North America, basically all of US and Canada and even into Mexico is one grid. Western Europe and even largely into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union is one grid. I'm pretty sure Japan, each island probably has a grid. Maybe they're even interconnected inter-island. Australia has a grid. There's these large systems, but the North American one is the largest grid in the world.
Largest, by density or amount of infrastructure, or
by the amount, the size and cost of the infrastructure.
How was I comparing those to, just in relation to China, for example, because that's a huge landmass and higher population density, those developing?
Yeah. China still has, if you think about it in terms of electricity use, somewhat less energy use than the US and Canada. They do have, but they also use a lot of coal, for example, in industry. But I'm going to move on.
Sure.
I want to emphasize this infrastructure. This is just mapping transmission lines. Okay, this is just this high voltage system. It's not even, you can't even see on that map the substation, the distribution lines, and it doesn't map the power plants. That whole system, we're talking trillions of dollars of investment that has been invested over the past several decades. Just to give you a sense of the scale here, a single coal power plant, does anybody have a sense of roughly how much that would cost to build?
4 million?
What did you say?
4 million?
4 million? Any other guesses?
50 million.
50 million?
I'd say 100, somewhere between 100 and 500 million.
100 to 500 million.
1
Okay.
billion.
How about 1.2 to 3 billion?
Whoa, look at these guys.
To build just the plant?
I mean,
just
that's
the
a
plant.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, just the coal power plant is in that range. Most nuclear plants are in the range of 2 to 4 billion. Okay, there's around 100 of these in the U.S. There's around 500 and something of these in the U.S. Natural gas plants usually they're cheaper, somewhere in the range of 100 to 300 million. Okay. The cost of these transmission lines that go through the whole system, it all varies based on when they're being built and all the technical complexities of it, but the approximate cost is $1 million per mile. Okay? And we have that many miles, which if you all look at them is about 600,000 miles.
Say it again.
How many miles?
We have about 600,000 miles of these high voltage transmission lines in the North American grid. If you do the math at $1 million per mile, that's $600 billion.
Oh. Can you move the whiteboard up a little bit?
And that's just the
That's just
high voltage
that's just the
transmission.
high voltage transmission lines. So I'm just trying to paint a picture of the scale here and the amount of investment and capital that has gone into building this system.
Just ballpark, how much is upkeep of this system per year?
Okay, you can think of upkeep as roughly the sum total of the fraction of all of our utility bills nationwide that goes to maintenance of the system. I don't know those numbers exist.
Subsidies.
Sorry?
No subsidies.
Subsidies are mostly subsidizing fuel cost and capital construction. We're going to talk about what all this means in a bit, but
About 30% maybe.
yeah, somewhere around 30%. So take 30% of about 300 billion. So roughly 100 billion a year. Okay, those are ballpark numbers.
Yep.
We have to do some detailed research to really get into it, but that's within. Say, give that an error factor of error of 30%.
That also includes extraction costs, which you could say is upkeep because of the nature of the system.
We're not going to go into that right now.
I just wanted to. I'm trying to make sure I understand.
Sure, I'm talking just about like
segmentation within my.
maintaining the infrastructure, not building infrastructure, not getting the fuel, just maintaining the infrastructure.
Thanks.
Okay, so we are all as a society paying a massive amount of money continuously to operate the system. The average American household spends a little over $1,000 a year maintaining the system through their electric bills, and a little over $1,000 a year. And depending on the area of the country, we also have what I didn't draw, which is the natural gas system, which we also spend a bunch of money paying for, depending on what sort of heating use and all of that. I want to emphasize, if you can go to the next screen share, that even though this is all one system, I'm going to get out of the way, this is actually different territories of many different utilities, and they all intersect. So what I have here is just a really quick image, and it's going to pull up there as well, of the service territories of the major utilities right around here in the Twin Cities. You don't have to worry about the details. The important thing is just to notice these borders and areas are very complex. So essentially what you have going on here is you might have one utility that serves that area, and another utility that serves that area, and a third utility that serves that area. And we have these all over the country managing different geographies. Now, we talked a little bit last time about how the energy utilities formed, and the corporate power providers and the municipal power providers essentially were saying it doesn't make sense to have multiple companies competing for the same area, so we should have a monopoly that is guaranteed to us within our service territory. And over time, the state government and ultimately the federal government said, yes, we're going to go by that principle of monopoly. And now we'll talk a little bit today about how that's starting to change. But in general, in each of these service territories, that utility has a monopoly. They also have an obligation to serve, which means any customer that wants electricity, the utility is required to provide electricity if they are in that territory. And no other utility can provide electricity in that territory.
This is slightly off topic, but just in relation, cutting off water to like Detroit residents. Does that not follow a similar principle? Like, is it illegal? Because they don't have an obligation to.
For utilities in general, there are certain rules about what constitutes a default on the customer's obligation. And water utilities and electric utilities, the rules are different. But at a certain point, I mean, yeah, what's going on in Detroit is screwed, but yeah. I'm just saying that obligation to serve doesn't mean the utility has to provide you power forever if you never pay for it.
Quick question.
Yep, go ahead.
When you say no other utility can provide power, what fits the definition of a utility there? Is there like a public utility definition, or does it vary depending on where you are?
So there are state definitions, and there's also a federal definition. The state definitions are the most substantial, so you'd have to look state to state. Most states, you either can't have any third party providing power to an entity, or there's a limitation on how many customers that third party can serve. So for example, here in Minnesota, a third party company could come along and say, I want to sell power to you and to you and to you, but as soon as it becomes 25 customers, they are a utility and they're regulated as a utility. There's competitive choice states, which we'll talk about a little bit later today, where this is becoming different, but I just want to sort of set up the framework first.
Great. That was very helpful. Thanks.
Is this slideshow online? We can get it
Yes.
now?
That'd be helpful to you now?
It's also being recorded on Hangouts on air. And
Okay, so it's, okay. So if it's
My
on
eyes
that
aren't
link, I
super
can
great.
get at it.
Yeah.
I can share the Savannah material. Is there anyone else who'd like
That'll
it?
work great.
Thank you.
Okay. Cool. So I also just wanted to pull out here that what you tend to have is you have these investor-owned utilities. In our case here in Minnesota, Xcel Energy have control of a very large area of the city. You have these little municipal utilities in brown that are controlling small pockets of cities. And then out in outlying areas, you have these very large areas that are controlled by rural electric co-ops.
The pink and the purple.
Yeah, the pink and the purple, and down here there's brown.
yeah, if you can color code them.
Yeah, oh, sorry. So for the folks online, the blue area in the middle is Xcel Energy. The little brown areas are municipal utilities. And the pink, purple, yellow, and the dark brown at the bottom are all electric cooperatives. And it depends on the region of the country, but you often have this kind of variability in who is served by who. And I always find it funny because usually if you live in a certain area, you have no idea that there's this variation in different types of utility service because you've only ever experienced one utility. And so when we were organizing around municipal utilities here in Minneapolis, people kept asking us, does anywhere else do municipal utilities, when in fact we have dozens within 50 miles of here. Again, just talking about how the system is set up. I wanted to really quick give an overview. Is this angled? Is that better angle? Yeah. Cool. For just the numbers, and we touched on this briefly last time, but I really wanted to draw attention to the number of utilities in each of these categories, and then the percent of customers. So there are over 2,000 public or municipal utilities in the country. These serve communities anywhere in size from Los Angeles and most of Long Island, all the way down to tiny little towns with just a couple hundred customers. Those 2,000 utilities serve about 14.5% of the people in the country. So 14.5% of the people in the United States get their power from government-owned, municipally provided utilities. The private utilities, investor-owned, there's only a little over 200 of them. And in fact, a huge proportion of the United States is served by probably fewer than 25. These are very large utilities. Those 220 utilities serve 69% of the people in the US. Most people have their experience from these types of utilities. These are corporations, shareholder owned, motivated by generating the greatest returns for shareholders. And then you have these 880 or so cooperatives, and they control about 12% of the customers, as we'll see in a moment, as we talked about before. They're a vast proportion of the geography. These are cooperatively owned, member-owned, and we talked about the history of this in the first video. I'm not going to touch the last category unless we really want to.
Just a quick definition on what a power market means.
It is an agency that produces electricity and sells it on the market.
What was that?
Are they below utility level regulation standards, or are they like middlemen type of business operations?
Originally, they were largely federal agencies. So the Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, generated power in hydroelectric dams and sold it to municipal utilities, cities, and a couple cases direct to customers. Increasingly, there are also private or more competitive power marketers that sell in markets because electricity is becoming more of a market resource. This next slide I just really quickly wanted to bring up. We don't need to go into the details, but this is just to show you a geography of the energy co-op service territory in the country. It's a little hard to see, but actually in all of these states that seem like they're covered by electric co-ops, there are little pockets that are not electric co-ops, which is investor-owned utilities, municipal utilities, which, again, for much of the central part of the country, are a tiny, tiny proportion of the area, but those larger utilities control most of the customers. So I just really wanted to emphasize this, and if you are in a community where you find yourself working with an electric co-op, we'll touch briefly on the ways to impact and change that, but it's a pretty important distinction.
I just wanted to say quickly, since the screen is shared, I can't see the chat on Hangouts. I'm wondering if anyone on the computer has any questions about the last slide or two.
This is Anastasia. I'm good so far. Thanks.
I'm having a little bit hard time with the color gradient and seeing like what means what.
Sure. So actually, this is relevant, so I'll go deeper into that. The electric co-ops, each of these tiny little areas which are grouped by color, are an individual distribution co-op. And so essentially what that means is that it's a cooperative organization. If you can switch back to the being here, that just controls a distribution area. So they don't control the production of power, and they don't control the high voltage long distance transmission. What they control is one or more substations and all of the individual wires going out to it. So these are local co-ops that essentially manage local maintenance of the wires in the system and billing and other kind of financial relationship with the customer. Now, they have to get their power from somewhere, and so what happened is groups of these distribution co-ops got together and said, we're going to form a larger co-op. This is called a generation and transmission co-op, or G&T, which is a co-op of distribution co-ops that owns and builds power plants and transmission lines. So for example, this larger area of kind of purplish co-ops in Minnesota is Great River Energy, which is a GMT, a generation and transmission co-op of, I think it's 37 local distribution co-ops. And GMT, which again is a co-op, sorry, erase that, GRE, Great River Energy, which is the co-op of co-ops, is the second largest utility in Minnesota. And they own coal plants and gas plants and transmission lines and all of that type of stuff. And they provide it to their local co-ops.
More provision.
Yeah.
Like, are these colors reused in this
Yes.
map? Okay.
Yes.
That's kind of.
Yes. You can kind of see them as like geographically grouped roughly.
Yeah. I'm like,
if you really want to get into like co-op strategizing, we can pull out a lot more detail in this, but
sure,
I'm not going to go there right now.
like,
Yeah.
Bird's eye view thing.
Sure.
Nexus.
I just as a quick side note, I want to note some really important opportunity for movement work in rural communities. Rural electric utilities are major institutions in rural communities. They also, as you can see from these maps, control most of the geography of the country, which is also great places to put wind, solar, all of that type of thing. And these companies also are often some of the dirtiest utilities. They're highly coal reliant. So they have direct control over a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure. And in fact, some of the generation and transmission co-ops, like GRE, together own major mining companies. So Western Fuels, which is one of the largest coal extraction companies in the Western US, is owned by a bunch of generation and transmission co-ops, which are owned by a bunch of distribution co-ops, which are owned by thousands of rural people. So you have a very indirect and convoluted, and there's lots of contractual stuff making it complicated, but effectively we have complex, imperfect, not great, but nevertheless democratic control over some of the largest fossil fuel extraction companies in the country through several layers and a lot of organizing. So just wanted to point that out. There's barriers, it's a mess, but just to go there. One more slide before we take a big change of direction. You have all of these utilities. They're all building stuff. They're all interconnected. There's power moving across their borders all the time. Back in the 70s and 80s, you started to have a big discussion around how do we manage the market for energy, because number one, you have utilities all the time. Electricity is moving across their borders through these wires, and that supplies power from one utility to the other and back and forth, because electricity goes wherever it's needed from wherever it's produced. And also you can have reliability problems. So what happens if one utility is doing a good job managing their own service territory, this other utility doesn't have enough power plants to meet their load, and suddenly there's a blackout? So they created these transmission management organizations, so these very large organizations that essentially manage the power flow throughout this whole system and the markets that govern the power flow. So who has to pay who, how much, when, for trading power back and forth.
Including failover.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. I don't need to go so much into the technicalities of it. There's a lot of layers of this. They have things
I'm
called...
not going to dive into all
Sure.
that stuff. Just...
Yeah, they have things called black start plans.
Yeah.
So essentially, how do you use certain power plants to ramp the whole grid back on if there's a major blackout? They have general reliability modeling, where they're essentially modeling the power production of all of these plants, and they have plans for, okay, if this one catastrophically fails unexpectedly, what do we do using all these other utilities? But then it's also just the market. What happens if one utility runs out of power and has to buy it from another utility? So there's real-time markets, there's day-ahead markets, there's long-term contract markets for different utilities buying and selling power from each other.
And these are all self-negotiated between each other?
Mediated by these independent transmission system operator organizations. Okay. So here in the upper Midwest, and now increasingly in the South, since they're actually connected, we have one of the geographically largest in the country called MISO, Midwest Independent Transmission System Operator. You may also have heard of PJM, which is, I think, the largest by load in the East Coast. There's one in California, one in Texas. There's the Southern Power Pool. There's one in New York. There's a New England one. There's all these different organizations that manage the flow of power. And again, the goal here is not that you understand every little detail about what they do, because it's complex, but more just that there are these organizations that set the rules for how utilities play with each other, and being able to change those rules is a really powerful lever. Just want to check to see if folks in the room or folks on the computer want to ask anything.
Yeah, that's nice.
I have a question, if
Yep.
we have time for it.
Go ahead.
Like, could you give an example of how we could change the way they operate, or what are some levers in the system that we could pull on?
Sure. So I'll give a local example. Here in Minnesota, Xcel Energy recently proposed in one of their long-term planning documents in front of their state regulators that they're going to shut down 2 of their largest coal units in the state, Sherco 1 and 2. As soon as they announced that, MISO, which is the system operator, started doing analysis and said, hey, if you shut those 2 plants down, it's going to create a problem for reliability. Meaning, not having those 2 plants could result in blackouts, brownouts, power surges, other problems that would affect customers. So if you're going to shut those plants down, you need to have a plan that's going to solve that reliability issue. And currently, what Xcel has to do is essentially figure out how they are going to place enough power at that location on the grid that is reliable to replace Shirka 1 and 2, which the way the question is asked, the obvious answer is, oh, we just build another power plant on that location, and it has to be reliable, and the main way we do that is natural gas. If we could change the rules about how Excel had to do the analysis in responding to that MISO problem, to say, you need to analyze not just putting the same size of power plant or similar size of power plant at the same location, you have to compare that option with the option of reorganizing the transmission lines and wires of the grid and putting clean energy in many locations and using smart grid technology to create the same reliability solution. Excel doesn't have to do that right now. There's organizers who are pushing them to do so. But if we could get the rules of the transmission operators to say you have to analyze that opportunity, that alternative, they'd have to demonstrate why building a new natural gas power plant is better.
So real quick, I understand why a lot of companies tend to not do things they're not obligated to do. But for instance, if they said we want to shut down these 2 coal plants because we're getting a bunch of rowdy protests or something like that, and MISO said, okay, then you have to have something in the area that replaces that. Though Excel may not want to at the moment, would it be possible for them to say, well, actually, we only need to cover 60% of that because we're bringing in 40% of this local renewable, something like that? Like, is that possible? Even they may not want to do something like that.
It is possible, but one of the things I want, a key thing to understand here, this whole system is based on the principle of you have very large centralized power generating units in certain locations, and the grid is built to carry power from those locations to the places which it's used, which is largely cities and major industrial areas.
The infrastructure is not even functional for...
So renewable energy is dispersed.
Yeah.
You can put a little bit here where the plant was, but you should put a little bit here and here and here and all over the place. Both because you can't pack as much clean energy into the same acreage footprint as you can a giant power plant, and the renewable energy is much more reliable if you spread it around, because it's going to be windy here versus here versus here, whereas if you put it all in one place and it's not windy, you have a massive drop in power, and you don't get to choose when that happens. So part of the problem here is that our capital investment is set up for a certain way that power moves and not the way that power makes sense to move for clean energy.
Like the physical infrastructure for power to move that isn't compatible with alternatives.
And you get all sorts of weird political arguments, like there's been a big push over the last 20 years to build a major transmission upgrade called CapEx 2020, which is promoted or argued to be about moving lots of wind energy from the Dakotas to the Twin Cities and Chicago. A big piece, like that requirement, is about making clean energy reflect that central station model, which essentially requires the backup of that wind power, which is located in those specific locations, with natural gas plants that are also tied into that same grid. So the continuation of investments that are being talked about as like, this is an investment to mean more wind energy, essentially bakes in or obligates the utility to also make investments in the types of power plants that they want to invest in all the time.
Partially because they're consistent?
You're asking why they want to do it?
But like why they would be obligated to do it, because wind is not as...
It's not as consistent, and they're building wind in the same model as they built all these other things, which doesn't balance.
Yeah.
Jeff?
So for these ISOs, in terms of influencing policy or those sort of rules, how are the ISOs owned and operated? Are they like partnerships between the utilities? Are they related to a PUC?
They are quasi-governmental agencies, so they are technically fully independent of any government. They are meant to be like technocratic, like we just, we don't care about politics, we just make analytical decisions and inform everyone. Of course, that's not really how it works. Everyone has an interest in this. I've had a lot of local utilities, so municipal and cooperative utilities, say that MISO is really structured to benefit the large investor-owned utilities. I have some backing for that, but that's only one perspective. That the policies in each state and the regulation within that state have a huge influence over what goes on within that state, but it doesn't allow the state to do something that creates a problem for the reliability or financial markets of MISO as a whole.
So MISO sort of has sovereignty above sort of the individual state decisions, or they're operating within MISO's rules. That's difficult.
So it's not, MISO isn't really rules that the transmission system operator imposes on what a state can do. It's rules on what a utility can do.
Right.
So it's kind of like the utility has to play to both systems.
Mm-hmm.
The state and
the independent transmission systems operator. And the transmission systems operator doesn't really give a policy objective. Like, it doesn't say, you at utility, you need to do X. It's more like, if you decide to do X, here's all of these criteria and parameters about how you have to do it, what you have to pay for it, and so on and so forth.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
It's not a lot different saying, like, either do X or terrible things will happen. It's just saying do X. Like,
And it's usually not that straightforward in one
Of
policy
course.
direction, but
Yeah.
yes, there is an influence there.
Yes.
I'd like to move on from talking about ISOs, but does that kind of layer of this whole system make sense?
Yeah.
Again, just want to check on the computer if there's questions. Okay.
Nope, doing okay. Thank you.
Cool. I'm going to switch tracks to talk about how utilities make money. And this is really key because we're going to be getting into what's changing right now and why utilities, they call it the utility death spiral. And it's hugely important for a moment in time and is, in addition to energy being super important, to me it's one of the reasons why, like, now is the time that we get to totally change this thing. So I've written up this formula, which I'm hoping y'all can see, which is an approximation and a simplification. But this is basically how they calculate what we pay for energy. And now I'm going to contrast this before I go into explaining it all. I'm going to contrast.
Can you read it out, Timothy? I can't see it. Can you read it? I can't see it.
Okay.
I believe it's actually on, is that on slide 8?
I don't think it is.
Well,
So it says price.
Profit mark, okay.
Price is about equal to this whole. Wait a second. Is it on it?
It's really close.
It's a very close.
Yeah. Actually, go 2 slides ahead. I thought I had taken this one out, but if you can do this, price is about equal to all of the utilities expenses plus the cost of infrastructure divided by the lifespan of the infrastructure with a rate of return, all divided by everyone's energy use. Now, if that doesn't fully make sense, that's totally okay. We're going to talk about what this is and why it is. But I first wanted to contrast this with how prices are set for just about anything else in our society. So when you go to the grocery store and you buy a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk or whatever you buy, or you go and buy a car, why is the price that it is? What are the things that affect that price?
Cost to produce.
The cost to produce is key, okay? A business isn't going to sell you the thing if they can't get more for it than it costs them to produce. Cost to distribute?
Like, probably everywhere.
someone on the computer have something?
Any applicable taxes?
Taxes, okay. So right now we're all talking about cost factors. So there is some floor, which is all of the cost factors, that below which a business is not going to sell you a thing because they'd lose money. But are they just going to sell you whatever they're selling you at the cost to produce it to them? No.
Nope. The markup, whatever they are able to get from you, basically.
Okay, and what determines what they're able to get from you?
Competition.
Your
Yes.
willingness to pay.
Competition. So your willingness to pay and the competition between themselves and other providers. Okay? So like if there was only one bread company, right? Their whole cost production factor would be, you know, whatever it is. And then at a certain point, they would just say, hey, people like bread. I'm going to charge 10 bucks a loaf. Okay? I'm the only bread company. You got to buy bread from me. Okay? But that's not how it actually works, because some other bread company says, hey, I'm going to come in and sell you that bread for 8 bucks a loaf, because it's still above the cost to produce. And then somebody else comes in and says, I'll sell it to you for 5. And pretty soon we have 99-cent bread.
Yum.
About that, but okay.
And antitrust lawsuits.
Sure. So for most things in our society, the price is set by competition. And that's how we, trusting the market, get a fair deal. And I'm not going to argue that that's actually fair. I'm just going to argue that there is an inherent self-regulation, to some degree, on each of the suppliers charging us an arm and a leg just for no reason other than they want to make a ton of money. Essentially, the competition is somebody else will give you a better deal. We don't have to regulate prices. I mean, maybe we could argue for some things like housing. It would be smart if we did, but in general, there is this cost competition thing going on that in our society we decide we don't have to regulate prices for an awful lot of things. However, in the utility industry, at least historically, and we'll talk about how this is changing, there's no competition. And electricity nowadays is a basic vital need. You want light, you want heat,
Cook your food.
right? You know, yeah, cooking, computing, like anything nowadays. We talked about how essential this is. You need electricity. So what's to stop them from charging an arm and a leg for it?
Easy.
The Public Utilities Commission, the PUC. In some states this is called a Public Service Commission. So there is a state agency that's essentially alongside, essentially this was the deal. We will give you a monopoly. We will let you control all of the business activity in this geographic area if you allow us to regulate your rates. We as the state government get to tell you, utility, how much you are allowed to charge customers. And then becomes the massive question of how do you decide what is fair for how to charge customers. And essentially what goes on is the utility brings a whole bunch of information to the state regulators. Here's our cost of coal and our cost of natural gas, and here's how much it costs us to build this power plant and that power plant and those transmission lines and so on and so forth. And here's how much capital it took. Here's how much investment we had to bring in from our private shareholders to build all that stuff. And hey, state regulators, you tell us what we should be able to charge so that we make some profit and are able to do our thing. And this is a highly simplified version of the formula the state uses to decide that. So now I'm going to go through and explain it. And this is the same formula I mentioned earlier for those of you on the computer. The price is roughly equal to utility expenses plus cost of infrastructure over lifetime with a return, all divided by energy use. The top section here, this everything above energy use, is sometimes called the revenue requirement. It is the amount of revenue that the utility must make to stay in business.
To be profitable.
To be profitable. Okay. Again, part of the social contract here is we're going to treat energy as a public good. Everyone needs it. It must be provided. And therefore, but we, the public, because we don't believe in socialism in this country, yes, don't want to spend public money. And like honestly, that would be a whole lot of public money building and maintaining this thing, because this is trillions of dollars. We talked about that. We don't want to spend public money on that because that would mean lots of taxes, and we We can have these political conversations, but this is the argument. So instead, we want to incentivize, we want to give a reward to private investors who are going to take the risk of paying to build all this stuff. And we need to make sure that they get some kind of profit and return off of it. This is the social contract that was effectively made in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and dominates to this day. So here's what all these things mean.
It's a series of laws that went into effect, a series of legislation.
It's legislation, some at the state level and also at the federal level, that created the system of utility regulation, which is now administered by public utilities commissions. And there's also federal laws and the kind of like Federal Public Utilities Commission, which is called the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, which manages the interstate, like between state exchange of energy.
So this is 30s, 40s, 50s?
Yeah, I mean, this all like started to emerge in some locations, even in the like, I guess it's called the aughts and teens and 20s, but then it became much more of a national system. Yeah, definitely by the 1950s. So explaining what all of these sections are, the first thing that's on our utility bills, and that's always covered, is all of the utilities' operating expenses. So this is the cost of all of their employees, staff time, and medical insurance, and so on and so forth, benefits. It's also all the cost of all the fuel that they buy, all the coal that they buy, all the natural gas that they buy, the contracts, the purchasing contracts from privately owned wind farms or solar farms that are just selling them electricity. All of the utilities' expenses, where it's just an annual expense, get included in this revenue requirement. Okay? I want to emphasize there that there is not a direct financial incentive to the utility to cut costs because all of their costs are reimbursed.
Also, there seem to be a number of places to create costs.
Yes, it's also important to note that there isn't, other than like CEO benefits or like things like that, it doesn't affect their profits. If they increase costs, it's neutral to them.
Right. Okay, good.
For example, Timothy was just talking about one factor that goes directly into that being the wages and salary of the employees. We're in a time right now where people are constantly protesting about CEOs getting gigantic bonuses and insane salaries. Now, like, whether their salaries are reasonable or not, or something, they go into that cost directly.
Totally.
So that's something that we're paying for depending on how they decide they want to pay themselves.
Yes.
Regardless of how much to extract this from the ground to transmit it, so whatever.
Yep. In fact, there are some things here that get quite ridiculous. Like here in Minnesota, part of Xcel Energy's revenue requirement is paying for 3 or 4 of Xcel's executives to fly, is it daily or twice a week, from Denver to Minneapolis, and on a private jet. So part of the reasonable operating expenses is us paying. I think it ended up being $32 million a year.
Wow.
What?
To own, charter, fly, operate these private planes, just because they.
This was approved by.
And this was approved by the Public Utilities Commission.
Denver is very, very pretty.
Yeah, it is. I know it's good.
I know it sounds expensive, but you gotta see it.
Live there.
There you go.
Okay.
He's on the side.
So I'm not saying that all of these things are in any way reasonable, but just recognizing that there's a lot of expenses here. Okay. But that's not all of the stuff that they built, because that's not an operating expense. That's a capital expense. Okay. They build this coal plant for $1.2 to $3 billion. That plant's going to last 40 or 50 years, and that's a capital investment. And so this factor is really about that. And part of the reason that this is simplified is that every bit of infrastructure in their system was built at a different time, has a different lifespan. There's all sorts of factors going on. But essentially, for each of these pieces of infrastructure, they say, here's what it costs us to build, here's how long we expect it to last every year. you, the ratepayers, have to pay off that fraction. Plus, you have to give us a rate of return on all of the capital that we have invested. For most utilities in this country, that rate of return is somewhere between 9 and 14%.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah.
And if they get like a 4% return, they can sue the Public Utilities Commission in court for where's their extra 5%?
Essentially, the argument they make is if we don't get this return, it'll be hard for us to attract investors to invest in the necessary operation of all of this.
So is that like directly to the risk that they're arguing that's a...
They argue that it's highly related to their risk. Now, in stock portfolios, utility stocks are highly attractive because they are very low risk and very high return. So there's a little bit of a, that doesn't quite make sense here. Although nowadays we're actually starting to get into a place where these investments are more risky because of the things that we're going to talk about. Okay? But does this make sense? We're paying for their operating expenses plus a share of all of the stuff they've ever built with the rate of return on that capital. That's what we all pay for.
Plus a share of what?
A share, like the per year share of the cost of all of the stuff that they've built with the rate of return.
In terms of maintenance.
No, maintenance is operating cost.
Like the annualized infrastructure investment.
Like let's say this plant, let's just do round numbers. Let's say it was a $3 billion plant and it's going to last 30 years. Every year we all have to pay $100 million of that cost.
Because we subsidize the creation? Or
No, because they're recapturing the capital investors put in that $3 billion, and we all pay off the $3 billion.
Yes.
We pay off through our energy bills. It's, I don't know if you call it subsidizing, but
And some to get them a good return on investment.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
We have to pay, if it's $3 billion and 30 years, $3 billion divided by 30 is $100 million. That's the cost of infrastructure divided by the lifetime, plus 9 to 14%
For the capital
for
investors.
the capital.
And that's so the customers didn't have to pay that themselves altogether.
Exactly. I mean, otherwise, Excel would have had to go around back in 1970, whenever, and said, hey, person number one on the door, I need you to pay me $10,000 right now, and then go to the next person, the next person, the next person, and whatever 3 billion divided by 10,000, whatever the number would be, then they get to build a coal plant, right?
Yeah,
they didn't do
because
that.
we would have gotten a lot of no's.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And yeah, that's a lot of money. Okay.
That makes sense.
And then, of course, this is the revenue requirement, and to get the per kilowatt hour price, you just divide by the number of kilowatt hours
used by the individual or household.
used by everyone. So this is going to be a huge number,
okay,
right? Like
yes,
this
yes.
number
Yeah,
for
yeah,
Excel
I think
Energy is about, this top number, Excel's nationwide operations is about $11 billion. But there are, per year, yes. This number is, I don't even know, probably billions, no, trillions, high billions, low trillions of kilowatt hours, okay, from everyone.
The denominator?
Yeah.
Oh.
And then you divide that and you get the price, which right now for residential customers in Minnesota is about 12 cents per kilowatt hour.
And that's before you get into like the other like fees that cause price variations for different customers based on.
Right. That's part of why this is approximate.
Yeah.
Is that there really isn't just one price for all customers. Residents get one price. Industrial, commercial entities get one price. Well, actually, there's all sorts of different industrial and commercial entities, and they get different prices. There's various state regulations that change the price in one state versus another, or even like city fees that change the price in one city versus another. So there's a whole bunch of things that go into it, but this is basically how it works.
We have a question on the computer. Oh, Chris, sorry, were you about to?
Yeah, I was gonna. Yeah, thanks, Patty. Timothy, I was wondering who and if it doesn't feel relevant for this conversation, that's fine. But I'm curious, who are like the typical investors in utilities? Like, where is that money coming from?
Sure. I mean, it's a stock market. So utilities, and this is actually to some extent true. Utilities like to say that they have a very broad range of stockholders. And again, because utility stocks are pretty good, a relatively high number of small investors and mutual funds that are contributed to by lots of small investors own utility stock. But also a huge portion of utility stock is controlled by the same people who control a huge portion of all stock, which is private equity firms, extremely wealthy individuals, I mean, Wall Street. So, I mean, these are public offerings. Anyone can buy them. I could go out and buy Xcel Energy stock if I wanted to, but the amount of Xcel Energy stock I can buy is like tiny compared to like the people who have, you know, 2 billion in it. Did that answer the question?
Yep, thank you. That's what I figured. I just wanted to be sure.
Yeah. And I'm simplifying a little bit because not all of the capital to build all of this came from stock. In fact, a lot of it came from debt. So there's like a ratio between how much stock the utilities have that they put the money at risk, and then they take out long-term loans to finance the rest of it.
Loans from who?
It depends. Large banks in many cases. In some cases, especially with rural electric co-ops, the federal government. The federal government essentially financed the construction of rural electric co-ops at tens of billions of dollars back in the day. And again, like these are long-term investments. So a lot of these loans are 40 and 50-year loans. They may have built them 30 years ago. They're still paying them off.
Okay. Isn't it all just our money anyways then?
Yes, it is all our money.
So
The whole revenue, everything that pays the lenders, the investors, whatever, it's all money from energy users that is being paid for the cost of energy. And the cost that we pay is regulated by state law, which is set by our representatives.
it's either taxed and subsidized, or you pay it at like we pay our bill.
Yes.
And these long-term loans were basically insured by the existence of American taxpayers continuing to exist, in a sense, because after the plants are produced, I will put that down, which also partially explains some of the intransigence about long-term investments and not wanting to away from.
Yes.
Thank you.
There you go.
So here's a couple of insights to draw out of the system. Number one, because these investments have already been made, they are huge investments and they are very long-term investments. The utilities do not want to do anything that hurts their ability to repay all of the capital that they've sunk into these investments. Even if there are cheaper ways of doing business now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Because even if there are cheaper ways of generating and delivering electricity right now, if it takes away their ability to make money and pay off all of the stuff they've already built, then it's a losing proposition for them.
It would have to be such a juicy transition that it would be paying off the basically sunk costs.
For them to do it.
Every once in a while, I mean, it's awful, and it is part of why this whole system is locked up right now.
Yeah.
But at the same time, one of the best things for us as a movement to keep the energy system of the future from being controlled by utilities is the fact that if they do it right now, they're shooting themselves in the foot. Okay?
So if they transition right now?
If they transition right now, they are hurting all of their past investments, and there are hundreds of billions of dollars locked up in
So
those
they won't be able to get
investments.
new investor or attract new investment?
I mean, they totally make money off of wind,
Debt.
but if you make, and there's more reasons than just kilowatt hour for kilowatt hour, but you're essentially taking away the profitability of all the stuff they've already built.
So you're saying that, but for folks who are trying to pull some levers to move to a renewable distributed system, that pushing them to try and transition now would be better because it means they don't have the funds and capacity to monopolize the new energy system.
Essentially what I'm saying is there are certain ways in which utilities are planning and wanting to control the clean energy future, but there's also major investment reasons why they can't move too fast on that.
Why they can't?
Well, or why it's unprofitable and they would get sued by their shareholders if they did it, which has nothing to do with the profitability of renewable energy and has everything to do with the fact that they've locked up so much capital in the old system.
Right.
Other parties, like us, like new cooperatives, like cities, like all of that, don't have those billions of dollars sunk in the old stuff, can make a decision that's different.
Okay.
If we have the power to make that decision.
I see.
And so kind of a key linchpin as a movement is how do we get the power to make that decision? And it has other really incredible impacts on the system. I'll talk about it in just a moment.
Are we going to be talking about that at some point in these trainings?
That is mostly what we are talking about in the fourth and final training.
Okay, great.
It is also
yeah, it's when someone says that proclaims that renewable energy will cause rates to skyrocket. It's not because renewable energy is still more expensive. It's less profitable for the shareholders, and then
they'll still
they use
have
that
to pay off from the coal plant they just shut down.
Matter of fact, they could have gone through the exact same process that these guys went in the first place. If the renewable energy is that expensive in the first place, but the price will go down over time, like that would be a start.
We're jumping ahead a little bit. I'm really excited about where we're going. I'm trying to catch one other thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Most businesses, if you think of that competitive model, they are incentivized. Their desire is to keep their revenue as high as possible and their cost as low as possible. That's what they're rewarded for, is that profit margin. That times their market share. Their market share being how much of the total market they control. Okay? Higher profit margin, more market share. And usually there's a compromise. If you want to gain market share, you often have to squeeze your profit margin. And it's the multiplications too. Throw that out the window. Okay? This is what utilities care about. And they care about two things here. One is how high is that percentage, right? And the other is how much capital is it a percentage off of, okay? The way they change this percentage is by convincing the state regulators to change the percentage, or by doing business operations that ultimately give them a higher percentage than they originally projected. And we'll talk, if we need to, we can talk about
What was the second one besides guaranteed profits that you said that the utilities care about?
They care about the profit margin, the rate of return, which is it's not set, but the rules are set so that it delivers this by the state regulators, and they care about the amount of capital that earns that profit. Now, the best way to increase the amount of capital that earns that profit is to build more stuff. Okay? So you may have wondered, why is there so much interest in building all these coal plants and natural gas plants and transmission lines and everything? It's because that's where they make their money. They get to charge all of us more for every piece of infrastructure that they're allowed to build. And all they have to do is convince the state regulators that it's needed. So if they can convince the state regulators, we need this new power plant, we need these new transmission lines, then we are all on the hook to pay for it, even if that infrastructure doesn't end up being necessary.
What about the obvious massive energy surplus that would occur apparently unless they smash their plants apart and keep rebuilding them like we keep rebuilding the Metrodome?
Yes, so this scenario that you're talking about, what happens when there's too much energy, this happened in the 1980s. Basically, until about 1970, the rate of growth in energy use was growing at about 9% per year. Energy use in society was just going up forever. In the U.S.
The U.S.
Okay, 9% per year. And so the utilities, when they were doing their long-range planning, essentially said, we need to build power plants. Because keep in mind, building these things takes 5 to 10 years. okay? So they need to build them well in advance of when they think they're going to need them. So they essentially develop their plans saying, our use of energy is going to grow at 9% a year. And pretty soon in an exponential growth curve, you have to be adding more and more, faster and faster, just to keep up.
Which is the definition of sustainability.
Or unsustainability. Just
Whoa.
Irony.
Okay,
Whoa,
that's the
sorry.
definition of irony. Okay. So this is what they projected. And so there was this massive effort to build coal plants and nuclear plants in the 70s and 80s all over the country. And that was the last time that there was a major wave of power plant construction in the country. Because starting in around 1970, there was actually a few years of negative reduction in load during the recession and the oil embargo and all of that. But after then, load growth has never exceeded about 3%, and it's usually been 2 or so. So they were expecting and building for this, and instead they got that. And they built, they were on their building curve, and somewhere around here they were like, wait, stop. Okay? And now they have all of these power plants all around the country that are cranking out juice forever and ever and ever, until finally now in about 2005, our energy use actually caught up.
How do they even disperse the excess energy in the meantime?
They idled plants.
They just didn't extract it.
These
Okay.
plants are sitting
Like,
around.
just burn the stuff.
No, they
Okay,
just
good.
didn't
Okay.
extract
Why,
it.
yeah.
They left them sitting there.
It's like, here are these power plants that have the capacity to generate energy,
Yeah.
right? That cost billions of dollars,
Yeah.
and that all of the customers are paying for the construction of those plants, and they're just sitting unused.
All right.
Okay?
Why was it like that? Like back in 2001, Dick Cheney came out with this report. We got to build these hundreds of new coal plants, and which were never built. But why was there even that perceived need if that discrepancy?
Well, again, energy usage, now the curve wasn't a 9% curve, it was a 3% curve. And even a 3% curve growing exponentially, especially with how much energy we were using by the year 2000, is still a lot of growth. And they projected, like growth thinkers always do, that that's just going to increase forever. And of course, if that increases forever, sooner or later, we need an infinite number of power plants.
I had a
Question.
quick question, Timothy. Is there also an element of, I know they do this with things like export terminals where it's kind of more obvious, but are they essentially planning more than they need, knowing that some will get shut down by the public and/or regulators?
Oh, yes, definitely. And also, in this industry, if it's unneeded, they still make money on it.
Yeah, no, I know that part, but yeah.
It doesn't actually matter to them whether or not those plants are used, as long as they are approved to be built. In fact, there's special modifications about how they're allowed to charge us, that they can start charging customers for plants that are projected to be built, as long as the PUC has said, yes, you can build these. So, yeah, this is a situation where it's kind of just like, as soon as they get the state regulators to say, yes, we agree with you that this is needed,
yep,
they've kind of locked in that we all have to pay for it. In fact, there's there's like 2 or 3 new nuclear plants that are being built in the southeast, Georgia and South Carolina, and they are billions of dollars over budget.
How
And
are they?
Well, they were supposed to be finished like 5 or 10 years ago, and they're still under construction. So, yeah, I want to emphasize that, like, a very, very high priority is stopping state regulators from saying that any new fossil fuel infrastructure should be allowed to be built, because we are locked in for paying for it whether we ultimately need it or not. And this is what the utilities do. They've built all of this stuff, billions and billions of dollars worth of stuff, and then we come along and say, we want you to build clean energy. We'll talk about the prices, but effectively, this is what they say. Oh, you want us to spend more money building this new infrastructure, which is going to reduce the amount of usage of the rest of this infrastructure. You're raising rates. let's talk about the actual cost to produce just for a moment. We're not going to talk about pollution and climate change and all of those, awful externalities, which are super important, but just purely in classical market terms, the financial cost to produce this energy.
By the producers.
By the producers, not the cost to society. That's a totally different number. We pay 12 cents. Any guesses on what it costs per kilowatt hour generated to produce energy from a coal plant?
Coal?
3. That's about right.
Coal?
Yep. 3 cents. Natural gas. Guesses.
So that's just the fuel, or is that including the cost?
That is the cost of the fuel plus the cost to build the plant.
Per kilowatt hour.
Per kilowatt hour.
Divided by 10.
Can you use a different color? Is cool blue perhaps?
Blue is fainter.
Oh, all right.
The blue looks like that.
Circle or something.
Right.
Never mind.
Nice.
Forget it. That's fine. So,
How about natural gas? 2.
I would say a little, I'd say a penny or less.
It's actually now
7.
Greater.
Yeah, it's now because it's relatively cheap. It's kind of in the 5 to 8 range.
Interesting.
Okay.
Even though the cost to produce the plant is far less. It's
Yes.
just the cost.
These also tend to be
Right.
smaller.
It's more.
Yeah. Well, it's that plus it's the transportation.
Well, because
you
they're
gotta
also
build the
building
natural
new
gas.
lines for that
Yes.
stuff as well.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yep,
Cool.
that makes sense.
and transporting gas as well.
Nuclear.
15. 12.
10 to 18.
10 to 18 cents. Good guess. So this is the best argument against nuclear energy.
Yeah.
It's just way too expensive.
So is this otherwise called the levelized cost of energy?
Yes.
Okay.
And also, let's keep in mind this doesn't cover the cost of
Disposal.
$10,000 years of nuclear waste storage.
Yes.
We don't have to
Where are
worry.
we
It's leaking into Washington State.
No.
Oh, it doesn't cover that.
Right.
Oh my
That would
God.
probably put it in the dollars range.
Trillions.
Anyway, how about wind turbines? Industrial scale, large rural wind farms.
1.
8.
1, 8,
2.
2.
10.
2.5.
I would guess it's almost as bad as nuclear given the new infrastructure.
Yeah.
2.5.
Wow.
Even on industrial scale, like you drive through the Dakotas.
Yeah, in fact, it's cheaper
Industrial
per
would be
unit.
cheaper than, yeah.
What are we paying wind source for?
Okay. Yeah, except it's more for
If it's cheaper.
solar.
5.
15. Oops.
But I would say easily less than 1 cent.
Actually, around 6 to 12.
Where?
It varies most
like
places.
utility scale?
Is that because
Okay.
of the cost of
Oh, okay.
solar cells still?
It's that and it's labor and it's various things.
Okay.
I could go down a huge rabbit hole with that, so I'm just gonna leave it there.
And this is all before sort of the reliability of the sources that doesn't take that into account. Or,
And the way the utilities talk about reliability is
yeah.
a problem. But yes, the thing I want to point out here is these sources don't necessarily actually cost more per unit in comparison to these sources. Part of the problem here is this whole system was built around the idea that you just read when people are using energy and you turn power plants on and off to match it.
Or
You don't get
burn
to-
more or less coal or whatever.
Right, exactly.
But
There's, yeah.
Sure.
You don't get to decide when you turn your wind turbines on. The wind decides that. You don't get to decide when your solar plant turns on. The sun and the clouds decide that, and the spinning of the earth, but that's predictable. So, number one, they treat these as highly unreliable because they don't get to control them. And when these are running, they have to turn off these other plants because they can't be producing more energy than is used. Otherwise, the voltage goes up on the grid and we all fry our appliances.
Sorry, I might have missed a little part of it. Reliability, where is that built into the equation for every return?
It's not. It's a condition that they are required to meet.
Okay, but, yeah, all right, I understand.
Cool. So basically, what I'm saying here is their financial incentive is build lots of stuff.
So those are infrastructures that don't relate to clean energy sources.
Even if they build their own wind turbines,
They can count it in there.
yep, they count it in there.
Okay.
So they make money off of building their own renewable energy.
Yeah.
But they hurt their own profitability on these other plants that they've already built.
So there's a net loss.
Yeah, or at least not as significant in net gain.
Right.
And that incentive to that treadmill of ever expanding investment to build a whole lot more stuff, that made sense when energy use was like was rising. It was a way to like to make energy access universal to everyone.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Just wanted to check to see if there's questions on the computer or in the room. Ethan?
So if their incentive is to build new infrastructure, why not jump on the wagon and build a crazy amount of renewables while still running the old system and getting return on investment there?
So, to some degree they are.
Yeah.
Most of what are considered the enlightened utilities are doing exactly that.
Gaming the whole thing.
Gaming the whole thing.
Right.
Xcel Energy, which is again our utility here, for a very long time has been fighting renewable energy tooth and nail, while at the same time advertising that they're the #1 wind energy utility in the country. They also just came out with a plan, which I was very excited about, even though I know that there's all sorts of problems with it, that they're going to be building 4,000 megawatts, which is roughly equivalent to 1/3 of their entire load of wind and solar in the next 15 years. Massive, massive, massive thing.
Ooh.
It's the State Public Utilities Commission docket. It's their integrated resource plan. It's like 300 pages.
I mean, it's game enough reading.
Yes. So some of them are doing that. Here's the other downside for them. Okay, historically, building these old types of plants, they were literally the only people in the business from a basic economies of scale perspective who could organize the capital to make it happen. Okay? I sometimes ask people in some of these events, you know, how many of you have ever thought to yourself, I'm going to start a business, let me go build a coal plant? Okay? Who's got that? $1.2 to $3 billion, right? This is not a community-owned business. This is in many cases not even a city can do that, right? It's too big. Same thing with nuclear. Natural gas sometimes is accessible, but it's massive amounts of capital. There's no competition simply because of the scale. Now the way they want to do renewables is exactly the same, because that's how they know how to do it, and nobody else can, or very few people, like Goldman Sachs and Warren Buffett and all those folks can. But if they do, you know, 300 or 400 wind turbines in a place, that's going to be $600 to $800 million. Okay, which puts it in a similar scale of capital as these types of things. Mm-hmm. Plus, they get to connect it to these high voltage transmission systems, and it's all in one place, so it's not very reliable, which means they get to build some natural gas plants to back it up. Okay, that's how they want to do it. But there's nothing about wind that says technologically it's only cost effective at that scale. It's almost as cost effective, like just a tiny, tiny little bit more, to size 5 megawatts of wind, which costs $10 million.
Wait, 5 versus what?
Versus 600.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's
Proportionally.
Per unit energy produced. We care about that number, right?
That's modular.
Because it's modular, right? Getting the wind turbine big enough matters for economies of scale, but doing 2 or 3 wind turbines versus doing 300, there's only like a tiny little savings. Okay. So the optimal economy, like people always think of economies of scale as just if it's just this universal, you do it bigger, it's cheaper. But for every industry and every technology, there's a certain sort of optimum point, and like you can keep getting a little bit cheaper after that point, but it's so marginal it doesn't matter. Plus, you have to build the transmission and all of that stuff. And yeah.
We've got a question on the
Question on the
computer.
computer.
Will?
Yeah, hey everyone. This is really good. My question is, why is it that they lose profitability on their existing fossil fuel facilities when they build new renewable technology? Because my understanding would be that the capital cost has already been factored into the rates we're paying over the next 25, 30 years or whatever it is, and that wouldn't go away if they build something else on top of it.
So
Yeah.
part of what I'm telling you is what is their argument for why they shouldn't do this in the first place. Because essentially what they say is if we're going to need to build that new stuff, it just gets added to the rates because people still have to pay for the stuff we've already built. So to the extent that the PUC buys that argument, you're right, they don't lose profitability simply from building the new infrastructure. All the customers pay more, but they don't lose profitability. The reason that they lose profitability, and this is kind of an important nuance. These plants over here, they are most efficient, especially coal and nuclear, if they're running basically full throttle all the time. You can't ramp a coal plant or even a nuclear plant up and down quickly. It takes about 2 days to shut off a coal plant. This is a giant furnace. So if suddenly the wind kicks in, you can't actually ramp down that coal plant very well. So you either have to, in which case you cause all sorts of maintenance problems on your plants, or you are essentially saying, this system that we are supposed to be cranking power out on, we were expecting as a utility to crank power out on this. We're not actually able to sell that power because we have to sell this power instead. Now we're not getting our rate of return. Oh, Public Utilities Commission, we need to get our rate of return. You need to raise the prices.
I see.
And this is the key to the utility death spiral, and there's so many things feeding into this right now. Okay? With wind to some degree, although wind at an efficient scale is still pretty big, it's 5 megawatts, 10 megawatts, enough to power 1,000 households or more. So it's community scale, but it's not individual or local scale. Solar is incredibly modular. Okay? It's a lot more expensive just doing it for a single house, but putting it on a business, a government building, you know, we're talking 200 kilowatts, right? 1,000 times smaller than the smallest size you could cost effectively build a natural gas plant. Not quite, but close.
More
Okay?
reliable than wind, significantly as well.
Well, and then the land use is different too.
And the land use is different, right? Because you don't even have to put this on land that you're using for anything else. You can put it on a rooftop. Okay? And when it's that small, it doesn't cost $10 million. It costs $200,000. And a city can do that easily. You personally might not be able to, but the folks in this room and a bunch of people that we know could pool money and do that. Okay? So as you start to introduce this type of technology, all of a sudden, all of your customers become potential competitors.
Yep, okay.
And that's taking away their market share, which was never in question before because they were a monopoly. But now all of us, increasingly, can generate our own energy. And the rules around how we do that are super important, and that's one of the levers. But essentially what happens here is, for all of these existing reasons, electricity costs are going up. Okay? They're going up because coal is getting harder to mine, and it's more expensive. Natural gas right now is going down, but honestly there's dynamics in the natural gas market that is partially going down because there's a glut on the market and a whole bunch of natural gas providers are losing money. So it's going to go back up someday. Okay? You know, we could talk about nuclear and all that. The financing of all of these things is getting more expensive because suddenly people are noticing, oh, the coal industry isn't doing so well. Almost 50% of the coal industry went bankrupt in the last 18 months. Okay? suddenly the cost of capital for all of this gets more expensive. So it's more expensive to do all of these things. So the utilities start raising the rates. In fact, electricity rates in most of the country have been going up 4% or more for the last 15 to 20 years. 4% per year for the last 15 to 20 years.
Is that inflation adjusted?
No, that's including inflation. But honestly, quite a bit of that time we were having near zero or even slightly negative inflation. Utility prices are going up. Now, renewable energy is one piece of it. A whole bunch of people start to look at, oh, you know, solar is getting a lot cheaper, and utility electricity is getting more expensive. Maybe I should switch to solar. You have a whole bunch of new and improved efficiency technology in the market. You can cut your energy usage from lighting by a factor of 5. Okay? You can get appliances now that use half as much electricity as they used to. You can weatherize and retrofit your home and decrease its energy use by 30%. Okay? There's all these things that you can do and that residents and businesses are doing and that the state and federal governments are promoting that reduce energy use. You reduce energy use and you generate distributed energy on the grid, you're effectively taking away from the amount of energy that's used. When you reduce this number to crunch out the same rate of return, the utilities have to raise the rates. Now, if the utilities raise the rates further, more people start asking, maybe I should invest in efficiency. Maybe I should develop my own off-grid solar system. Maybe I should get together with a bunch of farmers in my community and put up some wind turbines, which reduces the energy use.
So it's not vicious spiral.
So the monopoly is effectively the tipping point is coming right now. In fact, in some states we're already at the point where clean energy is cheaper. And yeah, we can go to the next slide on this, if my computer will work. Do you got that, Patty? We're getting to the point where energy from clean energy resources is actually getting cheaper than energy from fossil energy resources because all of these numbers are going up.
Like in Hawaii.
And this is a graph of nuclear versus solar. Nuclear is the gray, solar is the yellow. We could do a similar curve for wind and coal. We could match all of these on top of each other if we wanted, but this is the basic principle, the basic trend. More and more people start looking at this and saying, you know, I've never really liked this big utility that I've never had a choice about. I'm just going to switch. And right now, a lot of the people who can switch are the people who have money, the people who own their homes, you know, so on and so forth. It's privilege. But to the extent that we can change the rules so that becomes something that everyone can do, that can happen a lot faster. And as that becomes something everyone can do, we create direct and massive competition to what's going on here. And like they know that this is exponential. Okay? They are not worried about the 500 residents that are switching to solar this year. They are worried because they know that if it's 500 this year, it's going to be 1,500 next year and 30,000 5 years from now. And that's game changer because again, these margins,
The return.
the rate of return is massively influenced by tiny, tiny changes in energy use and price. And energy use and price are now inversely related. Okay? It never used to be, when there was no choice about using utility electricity, a substantial change in the price of electricity had very little change in the use of the utility electricity because people needed it. But now we have the technology options for people to choose. And so a relatively small change at the margin now in the price of energy creates a significant change in the use of energy. Tristan?
It sounds kind of like accelerating localized energy use helps accelerate that spiral in a sense, in a way that would require the rate of return they're expecting to go high enough that public pressure wouldn't allow it.
Yes.
Cool.
And that is the big fight that is coming on energy.
Is what? Can you repeat?
Sooner or later, because look, if we assume all the rules of this current system, those of us who switch to efficiency and clean energy are effectively raising the price of energy for everyone who doesn't switch. And right now, that's a huge equity problem, because the people who can switch are people with privilege, and the people who can't aren't.
The commission or whatever, they're like the fulcrum of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Who writes these rules that gets to say this rate of return is guaranteed and a utility should not be risky because it's a monopoly and it's essential? Our job is to very clearly say and demonstrate a utility is no longer a monopoly, utility electricity is no longer essential, and to a certain degree, you should have to compete. And sooner or later, that means the question, when we have stranded these billions of dollars in assets, all these coal plants that are not needed anymore, all these nuclear plants that are not needed anymore, all these transmission lines that are not needed anymore, how do we make sure that the grand bargain is not just all the customers have to take the hit? It's also the shareholders have to take the hit.
And the power holders.
And the power holders.
And some of the shareholders.
Okay? And like, this is super big and important, and like, I think as movement organizers, we have to be thinking about that long game, because sooner or later the question will be called. If we're committed to making all of these billions of dollars of infrastructure completely irrelevant, who's going to pay for it? And the default assumption is customers pay for it. And we have to change that default assumption.
Timothy, do you have a sense of timing-wise when that's going to start?
This is
something we should figure out.
Yeah.
Get out your books, people.
This is not a linear phenomenon, so it's very hard to predict. This is exponential and self-reinforcing, and it's influenced by also what oil prices do and how quickly the cost of solar comes down and how quickly certain policies like community solar and, I'm not going to go into locational marginal pricing right now, but all these very wonky things, how quickly those take hold. I am quite sure that the trajectory of our future energy system will be largely set within 15 years. Potentially much sooner. There are the initial foundations of these new ideas about how energy work already being laid in kind of the national leading states around the country. They're doing studies, they're doing negotiations, they're doing lots of arguments about this right now. Yeah, think tanks, utilities, state regulators, I mean. And like, this isn't something the utilities don't know is coming.
Right.
They've had their big industry center, the Edison Electric Institute. They put out a study focusing on the utility death spiral 5 years ago. Okay? They know this is coming. They don't know what to do.
They released this to the public 5 years ago.
They don't know how to make a business.
I mean, they didn't make a big, you know.
Sure, but still.
They don't know what to do, but still they're fighting tooth and nail to
slow it and prevent it.
Some utilities, in many ways, in at least some ways, nearly all utilities are trying to slow and prevent it. Some of the utilities are at the same time as they are doing that, trying to figure out what they do next. Right. And it's super messy, and even like Xcel Energy is a great example. They are still behind the scenes quietly pushing the legislature and pushing the Public Utilities Commission to slow and stop this transition. And they are very vocally and actively trying to paint themselves as like the solution and the new thing that's happening. And that results in, inside the company, people doing, pushing strategies that oppose each other, and they often don't know what each other are talking about.
Interesting.
And fragile public relations.
Cool. We're getting close to time, and I'm getting close to my 4 points here. How are people doing with this? Is this kind of creating some like, here's the landscape, here's at least some landscape of our strategy? Cool. I'm just gonna quick, if we can go actually back 2 slides.
Mhm.
Another factor that really matters here is that in the 80s and 90s, and this really took hold in the 2000s, more and more states started to say, hey, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense that we still treat utilities like monopolies. Because, hey, you can start building all these smaller power plants and competing and all of that. And so a number of states, and there was actually initially more of them than still are, decided to do this thing called deregulation, which doesn't actually mean that there's no regulation. It just means we're going to split up the company that generates energy, that owns the power plants and generates power of the power plants, from the company that serves the customers. And the customer gets to decide which company they're going to source their power from. They still have a local utility that manages all of their wires, but they get to say, I want my power coming from company A or company B or company C, and it just gets moved over the same grid on the same set of wires.
Every individual gets to make that choice, or?
In truly deregulated states, these blue states on the map, and I've found in detail that Michigan is not quite this way. They have 10% of their market that is deregulated. But in those blue states, yes, each individual can make that choice.
In which blue
individual,
states?
like account holder, bill payer.
Right.
The light blue states. The other states are purple, actually.
Oh.
It's been a
You
deregulation.
actually contact a representative?
Yeah, you can there's 2 or 3 different companies you can call.
Wow. Now again, most of those companies are dominantly fossil fuel companies, but there are in some of these states increasingly 100% clean energy power providers that are building wind farms and solar farms and signing up customers like that. So in these states that can be done. Again, that has the same effect on the main incumbent utilities of taking away their load. And what's starting to happen in these states that have competition is that effectively each power plant is now competing with every other power plant on the market. Hey, can you produce kilowatt hours as cheaply as this other power plant? And so in Ohio in particular, there's a big fight right now where the coal plants of the major existing utilities are no longer cost competitive with natural gas and wind. And so they're essentially saying, we're going to have to shut these coal plants down early because they can't make money. And that's going to create a huge problem for reliability. So the utilities have essentially been arguing to the state, well, customers can choose whether or not they actually get their power from us, but they should have to pay for it either way.
Also, pressure from wind and gas takes a lot less manual labor. There's pressure from out of work coal miners and things like that in there too. Is that right?
No.
That's right.
Natural gas and coal are actually the lowest employing energy sectors in the economy. We don't mine coal with people anymore. We mine coal with giant machines.
Blowing up mountains.
This is sort of a tangent, but the coal industry has lost 94% of its workforce in the past 40 years as we've increased coal production. So
I was kind of surprised there were wind, at least, but still.
yeah, it doesn't take a lot of time to maintain, but it takes a lot of people to build.
What are the highest employing sources?
Efficiency and smart grid technology, followed by solar and wind.
Light rail.
Cool.
I mean, in the energy sector.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
other things too.
Okay.
Which employs people.
So I also wanted to quickly pull out Illinois because in Illinois, Exelon, which is a major utility there, is making the same arguments to the state regulators that they will have to shut down their nuclear plants. Again, remember, nuclear plants are generally not cost competitive if the state doesn't guarantee that they'll be financed and allowed to keep open. So there's utilities now in these deregulated states that are sort of starting to push back on this, saying, you know, hey, if we do this, we'll have to shut down all these power plants, and that's going to cause all sorts of problems. So you should make sure we get paid for these power plants that don't actually make sense.
Oh, wait, so you pay, you can choose who you're gonna get energy from, and you pay them. And then you also have to pay.
So remember that you still have this.
It doesn't matter.
You still have this local utility that is supposed to just manage your distribution and billing and all that. And essentially what they're saying is, hey, you should force all the customers in this area to include on that portion of the bill, the distribution portion of the bill, funding to ensure that this plant still keeps operating, even if this customer is getting their power from over here.
It's not a taxpayer bailout. They're asking.
It's a ratepayer bailout.
Oh.
Okay.
Shoot.
I'm just gonna quick see what. Yeah, we talked about all this. We're just about at time. What I was hoping to cover. I'm gonna hit on this. Okay. What you see on the slide here is a map of the smart grid. And this is really about, as we have more efficiency, as we have more clean energy, how do we transform the structure of the grid? Because right now, if you think about it, this whole grid is designed as a one-way flow of power from production to consumption. And in the future, we're going to have production of energy distributed all the way throughout where all of the places it's used. And in fact, the guiding principle of efficiency here is you site your energy source as close to where it is used as possible. So you have the least loss of energy. And you match the demand curve, like when energy is used, to when it is produced as closely as possible. And this is a transformation of how we've thought about managing energy, because we've always thought about it as figure out when energy is used and turn on supply to match it.
Yeah.
With renewable energy, the paradigm is going to be figure out when energy is produced and match demand to use it.
At least geography, so that it matches demand.
Geography and time.
Sure, yeah.
And there's really 4 ways that you can make a renewable energy grid the dominant way of doing business, and we're going to have to do all of them. Number 1 is distribution. Put it lots of places and have lots of different types of technology, because that'll help it all back each other up. Your solar is not going to shine in the middle of the night, so you have your wind. Your solar in one location is going to get shaded by a cloud, so you have solar in another location. You distribute it a lot. Second is you have some kind of backup. So you have to have some, well, maybe someday we'll be able to get rid of this, but for the foreseeable future, some kind of energy source that you can quickly turn on and off. Right now, the go-to solution to that is natural gas, but it could be biogas made from anaerobic digestion of compostables or various things like that. There's lots of solutions to that. Third is storage. The kind of classic problem here is batteries. How do we get cheap enough, large enough batteries to store bulk power? That's a major technical obstacle if all you're thinking about is batteries. One of the current hot ideas right now is if we electrify transportation, and we have electric cars, electric buses, electric all of that, we could essentially use them when they're not being driven around as a grid battery, because you can feed power from the vehicle back into the grid when it's needed. And if we have, 100 million of these things, that becomes a significant resource. I have some concerns about car-based transportation, period, but we're not going to touch that right now. You can also do this through non-electrical means. So I love this. In Germany, one of the things that they do a lot is when they have too much energy being produced, particularly from their wind turbines, there's just so much being produced and it can't be used. They use the extra to pump water uphill. And then, when there's not enough supply, they just let the water run downhill through a hydroelectric turbine. So you use the gravity power to store energy. So there's lots of ways you could do storage. And then the final thing is using smart grid devices that can essentially be placed all throughout the system to tell your commercial building motor, your industrial motor, your HVAC system, your refrigeration. This could even be, they're starting to do this with air conditioning units in houses or refrigerators in houses. You sync it to turn on and use energy when the energy is available. So imagine a future where the times in which, because currently factories, for example, they produce at certain hours just because of their business conditions. Imagine the future business operating condition of a major manufacturing facility was operate when the wind is blowing. These are major changes in how we do business, but there's no fundamental reason not to do them. And that could essentially be this like huge economic swinging weight on when we use energy to match it to when it's abundantly available. So this is sort of flipping around the paradigm of how we do energy, and like also whenever you avoid using energy when it's in high demand, right? Like you're paying for energy at 12 cents. During that hot summer afternoon when everyone's cranking up a ton of energy, the marginal unit of energy doesn't cost 12 cents. It might cost 70 cents or $2. And the utility is losing money, you know, hemorrhaging money during those hours just to keep everyone's lights on. But if you turn off your dryer during that period, you are creating massive value for the utility. In fact, those kilowatt hours that you're saving are really worth 70 cents or $2 per kilowatt hour. And if we had this type of grid, we could set up the market conditions where they have to pay you.
Right, you get benefits as opposed to them getting benefits.
And then we as communities can effectively be grid participants and be energy entrepreneurs and be buying and selling energy with the utilities and someday with each other and make it a whole big market. And you know.
Wow.
So I would be like free to join this market?
Yeah.
Utilities get to change.
And like, I don't know to what degree this is going to be a high-tech revolution and how much this is going to be figuring out how we do a lot of things with much lower tech. So I don't know how much this is going to be programmed through smartphones versus people's behavior. But it can work either way. So we're basically at time. I wanted to check in to see if there were any final questions for closing. Our next two sessions, the third is kind of taking a step back from this whole energy picture and talking about community wealth building and how do we analyze the financial flows of a community or a household and think about retraining those towards social movement ends. And then the final one will basically combine everything that we have done in these first two with that one to talk about how do we do that in the energy system to essentially take control of this thing. But
What
until
are those
then,
dates?
they are 2 weeks from now and 4 weeks from now. I think they're the 31st and the 14th of June.
Talking about making renewable energy sources more localized. I hear a lot of people complain about wind turbines being like eyesores, in addition to the fact that, like, obviously you can put a big solar panel on top of a big building, but like putting this up, yeah. So I'm just curious about like localizing. Yeah.
In cities, you're going to see a lot more solar than wind. Wind is largely a rural resource, but it can be regional. Like we could develop a wind shed of the Twin Cities that provides a substantial part of the power of the Twin Cities. There's also very good evidence, and people have researched this, that the primary places where people have very negative aesthetic or other reactions to large wind development is when that wind is absentee corporate owned. Communities where wind is owned dominantly by people in the community, it has a very positive image.
There have been studies of that?
Yeah, in fact, Ripali has done a lot of that.
Yeah, okay.
I was actually just thinking Martha's Vineyard.
Yes. We could talk about Massachusetts.
That's crazy.
I mean, it's the principle of your own pigs don't stink.
Yeah.
George Crocker says that.
NIMBY?
Yeah, but if you're as a community making money off of this resource, it's much less of a like, this is the problem. It's, this is a tool for rural development.
It's your thing in your backyard.
Exactly.
I just
Someone
find
else's
crazy
deal.
because like fossil fuel infrastructure is so beyond ugly.
Most people don't have to see it though, and the people who do have to see it are
Right.
poor folks and poor
They
people.
don't have much that age.
All right, let's.
We gotta close. Thank you all online and in the room.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Colin had to jump off.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Talk in 2 weeks.
Oh, by the way, I happen to